Imagine being one of the most elite soldiers the United States Army has ever produced. You have passed selection. You have been to war. You have done things that would make most men's legs give out beneath them. And then you travel to a gray, rain-soaked corner of Western England, and a quiet, unassuming British sergeant with muddy boots and absolutely nothing to prove proceeds to dismantle everything you thought you knew about yourself as a soldier. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened when Delta Force trained with the SAS. And the story of what took place inside Hereford's gates is one of the most consequential and least told chapters in the entire history of special operations. Hi, my name is Arnold, and this is Delta Force Chronicles, the channel where we go beyond the headlines, past the Hollywood versions, and into the operational reality of the world's most elite units. The birth of the idea. Beckwith goes to Hereford. To understand what happened when Delta operators arrived at Hereford in the 1970s, you have to go back roughly a decade earlier and understand the man who set the entire thing in motion. Colonel Charlie Beckwith is rightly regarded as one of the founding giants of American special operations. A former Ranger, a Green Beret, a man of enormous personal courage and equally enormous personal stubbornness, which, as you will see, was both his greatest asset and his most persistent liability. In 1962, Beckwith was selected for an exchange posting with the British Special Air Service. The arrangement was relatively straightforward on paper. A promising American officer would spend time embedded with the regiment, observe their methods, bring something useful back. What Beckwith found when he arrived in Hereford was not what he was expecting. He had arrived, by his own later admission, with the quiet confidence of a man who assumed he was heading somewhere he would more or less fit in. He was a decorated combat veteran. He was physically formidable. He was sharp. What he had not accounted for was that the SAS operated according to a philosophy that was, at that point in history, almost entirely alien to the American military establishment. The regiment did not prize rank above capability. It did not run on the kind of rigid hierarchical order that Beckwith had been raised in. It prized individual initiative, patience, self-sufficiency, and an almost eerie calm under the most extreme conditions imaginable. It selected for those qualities with a brutality that Beckwith, for all his toughness, found genuinely shocking. He later wrote with characteristic directness that he arrived thinking he was going to show the British a thing or two. He left knowing that the Americans, for all their resources and all their courage, were starting from somewhere considerably further back than he had imagined. That realization would take nearly 2 decades to fully translate into institutional change, but it started in Hereford, in the rain, sometime in 1962, when a Georgia-born Green Beret quietly had his assumptions taken apart by a regiment that had been doing this since the Western Desert in 1941. The SAS selection problem. Before we get to the exchange program and what happened to the Delta operators who went through it, it is worth spending a moment on what SAS selection actually looked like, because without understanding that, you cannot properly understand why the Americans struggled. The SAS selection process, conducted primarily on and around the Brecon Beacons in Wales, is among the most demanding military selection programs ever designed. Crucially, it is demanding in ways that are not always immediately obvious. Yes, it is physically brutal. The long-distance navigation marches across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the British Isles are carried out with increasingly heavy burgans and under increasingly severe time constraints, and they break the bodies of men who are already exceptionally fit. The final exercise, known as endurance, is a 40-mile march with a burgan weighing over 50 pounds, completed within 20 hours, in winter, in Wales. I will let that sink in. But the physical component, as demanding as it is almost secondary to what the regiment is actually selecting for. The regiment wants men who can operate entirely alone, without supervision, without reassurance, without the institutional scaffolding that most military units provide. They want men who can make correct decisions under conditions of extreme exhaustion, extreme isolation, and extreme stress, and who can do so quietly, without drama, without the need to perform their toughness for anyone watching. The attrition rates during selection consistently ran between 80 and 90%. Not because the SAS were trying to be theatrical about how hard they were, but because the standard they required was genuinely that rare. When Beckwith observed this, and then observed the operational output it produced, small teams of men capable of going deep into denied territory, gathering intelligence, living off the land, surviving capture, and remaining operationally effective throughout, he understood immediately that the U.S. Army had nothing that produced comparable results, nothing even close. The exchange program and the Delta operators. By the mid-1970s, Delta Force existed, but only just. Beckwith had spent years battering his head against the wall of a U.S. Army establishment that was, to put it generously, unenthusiastic about the idea of a dedicated counter-terrorist unit. The Army brass were skeptical. Some were openly hostile. The prevailing institutional view was that conventional forces, properly applied, were sufficient for whatever threat the United States might face. Beckwith knew this was wrong. He had seen what the SAS could do. He had spent time in Hereford and come back changed in a way that he found difficult to fully articulate to people who had not been there themselves. And eventually, through a combination of relentless advocacy, considerable personal stubbornness, and the uncomfortable reality of a world that was producing more and more situations that conventional forces were simply not equipped to handle, he won the argument. Delta was stood up at Fort Bragg. Selection was being built, modeled explicitly and unapologetically on what Beckwith had observed in the Brecon Beacons. The regiment at Hereford remained the fixed point against which everything was being measured. The standard that Delta was racing to reach. The benchmark that justified the entire enterprise. And as part of the formal exchange arrangement that had been established between the two units, operators from each side would spend time embedded with their counterparts. The SBS and the nascent SEAL Team 6 had a parallel arrangement running on the maritime side. The intent, broadly speaking, was professional development and alliance building. These were close partners. These were, by any conventional measure, the finest soldiers each nation had produced. It was natural that they should train together. Now here is where I want you to pay close attention, because the next part of this story tends to get glossed over or quietly omitted in the more patriotic retellings. The assumption among at least some of the early Delta operators who made the trip to Hereford was that this was going to be a meeting of equals, a collegial exchange between professionals who had more in common than separated them. Perhaps even an opportunity to show the British what American Special Operations was capable of. They were, after all, Delta Force. They had been through a selection process modeled on the SAS. They were fit, they were motivated, they were sharp. How different could it really be? The answer, as it turned out, was considerably different. What the Delta operators found in Hereford was an environment that did not test the qualities they had been most rigorously trained for. It tested the ones they had not. And the gap between what the SAS expected and what the American operators produced became apparent with a speed that was, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable for everyone present. One former SAS instructor, recalling the period years later, landed on a phrase that has never quite left the people who heard it. He said, simply, that it was embarrassing to watch. Not because the Americans lacked courage, they had courage in abundance. Not because they lacked commitment or physical toughness, or the will to push through pain. They had all of those things. What they did not have, what their training pipeline had not yet given them, were the specific, painstakingly developed skills that the SAS had spent 3 decades building into every operator who passed through Hereford's gates. And in the absence of those skills, all the courage in the world was not quite enough. The tests, and the failures. Let us be specific, because vague gestures at inadequacy are not what we do on this channel. The first area where the Delta operators consistently fell short was escape and evasion. The SAS approach to escape and evasion had been developed over decades and was underpinned by a philosophy of patience and stillness that was almost Zen in its demands. An operator on the run does not move when he feels like moving. He moves when it is safe to move, and not a moment before. He can lie in a ditch, in the cold, in the dark, for hours, for an entire day if necessary, without fidgeting, without breaking cover, without making decisions driven by discomfort rather than tactical logic. The Delta operators, trained in a culture that rewarded aggression and action, found this quality extraordinarily difficult to replicate. They moved too soon. They moved too fast. They were found. The second area was surveillance and counter-surveillance. The SAS had, by the 1970s, developed a sophisticated understanding of how to follow a target without being made, equally how to identify and lose a surveillance team that was following them. This skill set had been honed in Northern Ireland, where the regiment's operators were routinely working in civilian clothes, in urban environments against an enemy that was experienced, locally embedded, and watching for exactly the kind of tells that would give an operator away. The Delta operators, when put through urban surveillance exercises in and around Hereford, made mistakes that the SAS found difficult to attribute to anything other than a gap in their training. They were too military in their bearing, too deliberate in the wrong moments, too obvious in ways they were not even aware of. The third area was close target reconnaissance. Getting eyes on a target, a building, a compound, a specific individual, without being detected requires a combination of fieldcraft, patience, and situational awareness that takes years to properly develop. The SAS operators doing the assessment found, on multiple occasions, that the American operators had moved into positions that compromised their concealment unnecessarily. Small errors. Easy to make. Catastrophic in a real operational environment. Now, to be absolutely fair, and fairness matters here, none of this reflected a lack of bravery or raw ability on the part of the Delta operators. These were exceptional soldiers, by any reasonable measure. What it reflected was a training deficit. The American pipeline had been built around a different set of operational priorities, and the specific tradecraft that the SAS had developed over 3 decades of operating in some of the most demanding environments on the planet was simply not something you could acquire quickly. It had to be taught. It had to be practiced. It had to fail repeatedly before it could be got right. And that failing process had not yet happened inside Delta's own walls. The interrogation phase. If there was a single moment during the entire exchange program that stopped people in their tracks, that made even the most experienced SAS instructors pause and quietly reassess what they were looking at. It was the resistance to interrogation phase, not the navigation marches, not the surveillance exercises, not the escape and evasion failures, as significant as those were. It was the interrogation. And I want to spend some real time on this, because what it exposed was not just a gap in training, it was a gap in philosophy. The SAS resistance to interrogation program had not been designed in a classroom by people working from theory. It had been built from hard, operational experience, from what actually happens to men when they are captured by enemies who know what they are doing and have both the time and the motivation to break them down. The program was not designed to be uncomfortable in the way that military training is typically uncomfortable. Uncomfortable is manageable. Uncomfortable has edges you can feel and brace against. What the SAS had designed was something altogether different. It was built to disorient, to dissolve a man's grip on time, on place, on his own sense of self, to take away the internal reference points that most people do not even know they are relying on until those points are gone. The interrogators themselves were the product of years of refinement. They had seen every response a captured operator might reach for: silence, aggression, false compliance, where a man appears to be cooperating while feeding his captors nothing of value, psychological manipulation, attempting to build a relationship with the interrogator and exploit it. Every one of those approaches had a counter. The SAS instructors knew what was coming before the operator in the chair had even decided to try it. And they were patient in a way that is genuinely difficult to convey. They were not in a hurry. They never appeared to need anything from the man in front of them. That more than the physical discomfort is what breaks people. The Delta operators went through this process and did not meet the standard. Several broke well before the threshold the SAS regarded as acceptable. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and wrong to present this as a character judgment on the men involved. It is not. Resistance to interrogation is a skill. It is a specific, trainable, developable skill that erodes in direct proportion to how seriously it is trained for. The American operators had not been through anything remotely comparable in their preparation. They arrived at a fight they did not know they were going to have, carrying tools they had never been given. One account describes an SAS instructor completing a session, stepping outside, and saying quietly that the man he had just finished with would not have survived 48 hours in a real hostile interrogation environment. No anger in it, no satisfaction. Just the flat, professional assessment of a man who understood exactly what the words meant. The lessons taken back. Here is where the story becomes something more than a catalog of failures. Because what Charlie Beckwith and the early Delta commanders did with what they had witnessed and experienced is genuinely the most important part. The instinct, when an elite unit is embarrassed, is to minimize, to attribute the failures to circumstance, to note that the conditions were unfamiliar, that the exercises were constructed to favor the home team, that the sample size was too small to draw meaningful conclusions. That instinct is entirely human and almost entirely useless. Beckwith did not give in to it. He went back to Fort Bragg and began tearing apart the Delta training pipeline with the specific intent of rebuilding the elements that Hereford had exposed as inadequate. Escape and evasion training was fundamentally restructured. The emphasis on patience and stillness, on the ability to remain completely motionless and concealed for extended periods, was built into selection and continuation training in a way it had never been before. Resistance to interrogation was overhauled. The comfortable, contained version of the training that had been used previously was replaced with something far more demanding, far more disorienting, and far more representative of what an operator might actually face in a hostile environment. Surveillance and counter-surveillance tradecraft, previously a minor footnote in the training program, was elevated to a core competency. Delta began actively recruiting from and training alongside elements of the intelligence community who could provide the kind of urban tradecraft expertise that the SAS had developed through years of work in Northern Ireland. None of this happened overnight. Institutional change inside the military establishment never does. But the direction of travel was set by what had happened in Hereford, and the men who had been embarrassed became, over the following years, the architects of a training program that produced a markedly different caliber of operator. The humiliation had been the price of admission to a conversation about excellence that the Americans badly needed to be having. The longer legacy. It would be a mistake to treat this story as simply the story of Delta Force. The ripples from what happened during those exchanges spread considerably further than Fort Bragg. The formal recognition that the U.S. military lacked a clandestine human intelligence capability capable of operating in the spaces that conventional forces and the CIA were either unable or unwilling to occupy was one of the direct intellectual ancestors of the intelligence support activity, the organization we covered in an earlier episode on this channel. Jerry King, who set up the activity, had his own experience working with the SAS, and the tradecraft deficit that the exchange program had exposed was very much present in his thinking when he designed what would become one of the most secretive and most effective intelligence units in American military history. The SBS and SEAL Team 6 relationship produced a parallel set of lessons on the maritime and amphibious side. The broader U.S. Special Operations community, which by the mid-1980s had been substantially reshaped by the failures of Operation Eagle Claw and the subsequent Nunn-Cohen legislation that created SOCOM, owed a quiet but enormous debt to the regiment in Hereford and its sister unit in Poole. And here is perhaps the most important observation of all. The SAS did not embarrass the American operators out of arrogance or national competitiveness. The British Special Operations community understood with considerable clarity that a more capable American partner made the entire alliance more effective. They pushed the Americans because they needed the Americans to be better. And the Americans, to their considerable credit, accepted the pushing. There is a version of this story that gets told as a straightforward tale of British superiority over American bluster, and that version is both reductive and wrong. What actually happened in Hereford in the 1970s is something more nuanced and more interesting. It is the story of what happens when genuinely talented, genuinely courageous people are willing to accept an honest assessment of where they fall short and then do the hard, unglamorous work of closing the gap. Delta Force today is widely regarded as one of the 2 or 3 most capable special operations units on the planet. That status was not handed to them. It was built piece by piece, partly in the deserts of Fort Bragg, partly in the mountains of Afghanistan and the streets of Iraq, and partly, more than most people know, in the gray, rain-soaked hills above a small city in Herefordshire, where a group of American operators were quietly taken apart by men in muddy boots and then sent home to do better. That is the story. I am Arnold. This is Delta Force Chronicles. I will see you in the next one.